Well, good morning once again. Brethren, one of the least understood truths of the Bible is the great overall purpose that God is working out. The fact that God is reproducing Himself. Just Genesis chapter 1 brings this out, as well as other things. We find in Genesis chapter 1 that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We find as we come through the account that is given here in Genesis chapter 1 that, as it brings out, for instance, down in verse 21, that God created great whales and every living creature that moves, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind. And God saw that it was good, and He blessed them, and He said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And in verse 24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind," and it was so. God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind, and God saw that it was good. God made the animals. He made all of the land creatures. He made the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and He made all of these creatures to reproduce after their kind. There's no room here for evolution. The birds didn't evolve into, fish didn't evolve into, into birds, or dinosaurs didn't evolve into birds, and fish didn't evolve into land animals, and mice or little ferret-like creatures didn't evolve into monkeys, and monkeys didn't evolve into people. Absolutely ridiculous. There's no way that you can square an idea like that, either with the laws of science or with the account that is given right here. God created the various kinds of animals, and they reproduce after their kind. Now, there is variety within a kind. There are a lot of dogs. There are big dogs, little dogs, shaggy dogs, short-haired dogs, all sorts of dogs, but they're dogs. And if you've got a dog that's expecting a litter, you know it's a litter of puppies. You're not wondering, if one of them's going to be a cat. They reproduce after their kind. Now, there's variety within that kind. And I think we understand that. But God created all of these creatures, and He said, let them bring forth after their kind. And this was good. But verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him, male and female created He them. Now, several things we see. God made the animals to reproduce after their kind. But now in verse 26, God said, let us, showing the fact that more than one being constitutes God. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. Now that, of course, is made plain. I think we understand it. You go back to John chapter 1, and we find that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. The one that we know as Jesus Christ, and the one that we know as God the Father. And they said, "Let us make man in our image." Let us make man not after the animal kind, not after the bird kind, or the fish kind, or the monkey kind, but let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So man was made after the God kind, but not made with the power that God has, and not made of what God consists. God is spirit, and man was made of matter. He was given an outward form and shape, and he was given a potential. God set something in mankind that set him apart from the animals. God placed a spirit within man, a spirit in man, that enables man to the mind of man to function on a level far above any sort of animal. Oh, you can train and teach animals to do various things, and animals can learn. They can develop a conditioned response. A monkey can find a stick to knock a banana down out of a tree. Animals can figure things out. Dogs can figure how to get over a fence by climbing up on something and getting over, or digging under, or all sorts of things. They can, in that very limited sense, but in terms of functioning on a human level, not at all. So God said, let us make man in our image. God is in the process of reproducing Himself. And we have gone through many of these things, and it's not my purpose this morning to go through and to focus in on all of that aspect, but I want us to get an overview to begin with of understanding that we are part of a great plan and purpose. That God is reproducing Himself. Now let's notice the commission that God gave to man. Let's notice the mandate or the responsibility that God delegated to man. He said, let's make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion. The first thing He said was man is to exercise dominion, rulership. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth. Now, that takes in pretty well everything, doesn't it? You take in all the living creatures and over all the earth. So, God told man to exercise dominion. He said God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him. Male and female created He them. So this rulership, this dominion, was not simply limited to the male of the species. God created man in His own image, man in the generic sense, male and female. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, you are to have dominion and you are to subdue. You're to have dominion, you are to subdue. Now, if we come on down, we have in chapter 2 a more detailed account of the creation. We find, of course, that really the chapter 1, the break from chapter 1, is really after verse 3 of chapter 2. The first 3 verses of chapter 2 would most logically be the ending of chapter 1, because that's where we're going through the day-by-day accounts. You know, the chapter endings or the chapter divisions were added in by men later. This was not the original text, just flowed straight through. Human beings added in the chapter and verse divisions simply as a means of being able to more efficiently find sections of Scripture. Because after verse 3 here of Genesis 2, we have the Sabbath, and then in verse 4 of chapter 2, we pick up a more detailed story that focuses in on one aspect of what had been told earlier in Genesis 1. We find that God planted a garden, and we find that in verse 7 it talks about that He formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The man became a living being. And God planted this garden eastward in Eden, and there He put the man whom He had formed. And as we come on down in verse 15, the eternal God took the man, put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. We find up in verse 5, you see, when God had made all of the plant and animal life, in verse 5 of Genesis 2, every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the eternal God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But This was, of course, at the end of after 5 days. There was not a man to till the ground, but God then solved that by creating a man. And He put him in the garden, and man was told to dress it and to keep it in verse 15. I want to call your attention to several words that are used here. We find that God told mankind that He was to exercise dominion. He was to subdue the earth. He was to dress and keep. Now, each of these words, it's interesting sometimes to go through and to look up how some of those words are used elsewhere. The word that's translated dominion, let him have dominion, is a word that means rulership. And that is, if we're going to look at, initially at 4 specific things that God told man to do that together describe the role that mankind has. Because mankind was put on this earth, made in the image of God, to serve as a steward of God, as an heir. Ultimately, we are right now stewards, but ultimately we are to go beyond simply being a steward, being a servant, to being born into the very family, because God is reproducing Himself. Now, these components of rulership, of subduing, of all of the things that are mentioned here are attributes of the role that God Himself plays. God Himself has, and He's made man to exercise that. This first aspect of having dominion, this is the same word that's used back in Leviticus 25. And here it's talking about, in Leviticus 25, it talks about a servant, servants that you would have. In verse 43, it says, "You shall not rule over him with rigor, but shall fear your God." Now the word rule here is the same word that's used back in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, where it talks about dominion. You shall not rule, you shall not exercise dominion with rigor, with hardness, without mercy and compassion. So it says in verse 46, speaking here of the strangers that would be servants to Israel, and he says, "You shall take them as an inheritance of your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondsmen. But over the brethren, your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. You shall not exercise dominion with hardness." Same expression on down in verse 53, where it says, as the yearly hired servant shall he be with him, and the other shall not rule, shall not exercise dominion with rigor. So we read here of rulership, and the fact that rulership, as God intended it, was not something to be exercised in a way that ignores the importance of compassion or mercy. Rulership is not something that is to be exercised without the right kind of balance. In Psalm 72 and verse 8, speaking here in Psalm 72 and verse 1, it says, "Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness unto the king's son. He shall judge your people with righteousness and your poor with judgment." On down in verse 8, "He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the rivers unto the ends of the earth." This verse, by the way, is sort of an interesting verse, as just an aside, but this was the basis of the British government creating what they called the Dominion of Canada. That was the official status of Canada, was a dominion, and it was based on Psalm 72 verse 8. Was the motto, dominion from sea to sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Dominion from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth, which were considered on up to the North Pole, the polar caps. That was the ends of the earth. You can't go any further than that when you get up there. And sort of interesting that they focused in on this verse. But here it says, you shall have dominion or have rulership. The point that I'm making is that the first mandate that God gave man was a mandate of rulership. It involved rulership. It involved exercising rulership. And there is a rulership that is to be exercised by human beings over the earth, over the animals. That's not something that's wrong. You know, there's all sorts of ideas around these days, and you realize, you know, some people go overboard in a variety of ways. Some sort of rape and pillage the earth and turn a forest into a desert, and there are others that go to the opposite extreme and are ready to shut down anything. You know, what was the farmer that some overzealous fellow from the Environmental Protection Agency got after him because when he tilled up his field, he destroyed the habitat of some little rat that happened to have a nest there. You know, ridiculous. You know, what was, of course, you know, if you've ever plowed up anything, well, there's something that you disturbed, you know. You could sit back and not disturb the ground. Well, God didn't put man on the earth and He said, watch it all grow up in weeds. He said, exercise rulership. Rulership is the first aspect, and that is an attribute of God. And that is a part of what God intends man to learn, is to exercise rulership. Now, we can go through all of the principles that are brought out as far as rulership and all the different things to understand how we are to rule. There's another verse that is there's another word that was used there. He is to have exercise dominion, and he was told to subdue. To exercise dominion and to subdue. And to subdue means to bring under control. And that, of course, is one aspect that ties in with rulership. The word that's translated subdue is the word that's used back in Jeremiah 34 in verse 11 when it says, afterward they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go to return, and they brought them into subjection. They brought them back under control for servants and for handmaids. On down in verse 16, you turned and polluted my name and caused every man his servant, and every man his handmaid whom you had set at liberty at their pleasure to return. And you brought them into subjection to be unto you for servants and for handmaids. Now, the point here, the word in subjection, to subdue, to bring under control, to make subject to. So, God gave mankind, male and female, a responsibility to exercise rulership and to bring under control. And bringing under control, you can't rule if you don't bring under control. Now, we're going to come back around and apply these things specifically in a few moments, but I want to understand a little bit about the overview of what God is working out and what God is doing. Now, the other thing God said in Genesis chapter 2, and we read it in Genesis 2 and verse 5, that He said that there was not yet a man to till the ground, and on down in chapter 3 and verse 23, we're told that God sent him forth out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. That's an interesting word, that word that's translated till here in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, because it's a word that most literally means to serve. Means to serve. It's the word that's used in verse 15 that mankind was put there to dress and to keep the garden. Now, this word, let's go back to Exodus. I want to show you other ways that the same word is translated in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 26. Our cattle also shall go with us, there shall not be a hoof left behind, for thereof must we take to serve the Lord our God. And we know not what we must serve the Lord our God until we come there. Now, this word serve is the same word that was translated in reference to the ground. It was translated to till. It has to do with being of service, with Well, as it says in Deuteronomy 10, the same word is used here in Deuteronomy 10:12, where it says, Now, Israel, what does the Lord require of you, but to fear the eternal your God, to walk in all His ways, to love Him, and to serve the eternal your God with all your heart and with all your soul. That, on over in verse 13, it's talked to serve. Now, we may not think about serving the ground in that way, but that's what that's in effect what's being done, keeping it, taking care of it. That's the sense of it. That's the sense of the word when it's talking about to till the ground. It's talking about providing the needs, doing the things that are necessary for the ground to bring forth and to be productive. That it involves an active role that human beings are to exercise, but the root concept is a concept of serving, a concept of performing a service. Now, we are not only to dress it, to serve it, but we are to keep or to preserve. And again, this is a word that is frequently used in the Bible. In Psalm 16 and verse 1, it says, "Preserve me, O God." That's the same word as rendered keep over there in Genesis 2:15. On down in Psalm 17 and verse 8, it says, "Keep me as the apple of the eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings." To keep, to preserve. We desire God to keep us and to preserve us, to protect us. And that was also a part of God's instruction to man. That was a part of the mandate that He gave to human beings when He placed them on the earth. In Psalm 140, verse 4, "Keep me, O Lord, from the hand of the wicked. Preserve me from the violent man who has purposed to overthrow my goings." Again, this concept of keeping and preserving. So what do we see? We see that God said you're to exercise rulership, you're to exercise control, you are to serve, and you are to preserve, to keep. So there is an aspect of rulership and there is an aspect of service and nurturing. When God made man in His image, God placed man in a category that no other creature on this earth had. And God gave mankind mandates that reflected the role that God Himself has. Because God rules, God brings under control, God also serves and preserves. Now, what we have to understand is that we are placed here on this earth to develop the character and the nature of God, to have His laws written in our hearts and in our minds. We are placed here as stewards. That is, someone in the role of carrying out instructions, of managing. God is the possessor of heaven and earth. Mankind is placed here to exercise rulership, to exercise control, which puts us in the role of managing that which belongs to someone else. Because we are not yet the inheritors of everything here. It all belongs to God, and we are the heirs. God ultimately intends that we will inherit the earth. But you and I have not inherited it yet. We are here, and it is God's. And He has given us a responsibility. A responsibility to exercise control, to exercise rulership, a responsibility to preserve, to nurture. The statement is made in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2. "Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful." The primary and first ingredient, the most important thing about a steward is that he's trustworthy. If you hire somebody to manage your business and you go away, most important thing is that that individual is trustworthy. Now, you want them to be competent as well, but if somebody is very competent but not trustworthy, that just means he can steal you blind quickly. You want, it is very important that faithfulness is there. That someone can be trusted. If you leave someone in charge of something, you delegate something to someone, you give them a responsibility, and you leave them there to carry it out, being found faithful, being able to be trusted, is of paramount importance. We understand that we have all been given rulership. That's what God says. And it applies to mankind. Male and female made He them. In the image of God made He them. God gave the responsibility to rule, to bring under control, to nurture and to preserve, and faithfulness is a great and important aspect. Are we learning to be faithful stewards? In all aspects of our lives, to what extent are we fulfilling the mandates that God has given us? You see, these mandates apply to every aspect of our lives. It applies to the roles that we carry out. Jesus Christ gave the principle, and we read it last time in the sermon, that if we learn to be faithful with a little, we will be ultimately given rulership over much. Right now, we have in whatever area of our lives, it's our family, it's our job, it's our home, it's whatever area of our lives that we have. Whatever aspects, whatever things that we have responsibility for. Whether it's our little spot of the world. It may be, a certain acreage. It may be, an apartment. It may be, one room. It may be our responsibilities on a job. It may be involving sometimes other people that we have responsibility and control for. It may be a husband. It may be a wife. It may be parents. It may be in a wide variety of settings. But if we step back, and if we get an overview and we understand what it is that God is in the process of doing and what it is that we need to be in the process of learning, because we are ultimately to be inculcating into our lives. And we have all of the various specific things that we do that are ways to practice, whether it's at home in the setting of our family or whether it's on the job in our interaction with other people. It still comes back that God has given us responsibility to learn how to be faithful stewards, how to properly exercise rulership and control, how to properly serve and preserve and nurture. That it's not something that simply goes to one end or the other. If we are ultimately going to be a faithful, functioning part of the family of God, if we're going to inherit what God has for us, we need to understand that right now, this is the laboratory session. This is the opportunity to go through and to learn and to develop, to find ourselves in circumstances and to learn how to make proper choices and how to demonstrate faithful stewardship in whatever areas. Sometimes people look at something and they say, well, this is minor, this is trivial, this doesn't matter. We're setting patterns. We're developing habits and patterns of character. None of us have been perfect stewards. Sometimes it's due to ignorance. We didn't know, we didn't understand, we found ourselves in circumstances and situations, and we all have found ourselves in circumstances like that, that sometimes we learn through some of the experiences that we've gone through. Sometimes we learn from God's Word, but maybe we hadn't at that time. Maybe we hadn't, God hadn't called us. Maybe we didn't understand. Or maybe we were in the process of coming to understand some things. So, we make choices. And we make decisions. What's crucial is that we step back, that we examine ourselves. We understand that God has made us in His image, after His likeness, has placed us on this earth, that we might learn to properly rule and bring under control that for which we are responsible. That we might learn to serve, to preserve, to protect, to nurture that for which we are responsible. And that both go together. If you eliminate one half, then you go to an extreme. Somebody is concentrating on, I'm going to rule, I'm going to subdue. God says, exercise dominion. Well, you know, the world's been filled with tyrants and despots that exercise dominion. Boy, they understood to exercise dominion. That meant I'm in control. And there have been people that have been good at exercising control. I say good at it. They've been effective. You know, the world has been filled with some of these dictators that have exercised great control over the populace. They've controlled all sorts of things. But they haven't served. They haven't nurtured. They haven't preserved. There have been others who've gone to the other extreme. And, you know, they want to help and they want to serve and they want to do, and to nurture, you know, to serve and to cause to grow. But by failing to exercise dominion, by failing to exercise rulership and control, you know, they wound up with weeds. They wound up with something that became overgrown and was not productive. We are to dress and to keep. We are to preserve, to protect, to rule, to bring under control, to nurture. It involves an approach to life, and it ought to involve an underlying approach in our families and on our jobs and in every aspect of life that we have endeavor. It's something that we want to use as a basis for stepping back and looking at ourselves and how well we're carrying out and functioning in the roles that God has assigned us. Both aspects are there. You know, if you take the example of a family, there are people who allow things to get out of control, and they may have love, and they may have consideration, and they may have compassion, and they may have many right and good feelings. But if they don't exercise rulership, if they don't exercise control, they wind up with a catastrophe. If they just exercise control and they're rigid in what they do, you know, either one creates an environment in the home that's not conducive to growth. A healthy environment. What is a healthy environment? Well, a healthy environment in any context, a healthy environment in agriculture, it's an environment that is conducive to growth and maturity. You know, if you create a healthy environment, a healthy growing environment, this is where a plant, an animal, a person, it's where in any situation, in whatever context, whether you're talking about a family context or whether you're talking about agriculture, where growth takes place and it's healthy, that means it matures, it develops, it reaches its potential, it bears fruit, that is useful, that is healthy, that is the object, the purpose of why it exists. If you're talking about wheat, well, you know, to produce healthy grains of wheat. That's why the wheat exists. That's why the plant exists. That's why it's there. Human beings are ultimately to bring forth fruit as well, and that fruit is listed back in Galatians. You see, we are to develop, and if we properly exercise our mandates, the God-given mandates that we have as human beings, then the environment that we have responsibility for will be a healthy, growing environment. There are two extremes. Neither one produce good growth. One is the extreme of being so rigid and so stifling, so, just so absolutely set and rigid that it stifles growth. There's no real development that can take place because it distorts growth. It's like if you band a tree, and the tree becomes distorted. You've all seen that. I'm sure particularly in the country, sometimes people would nail their fences, if there were trees along the way, nail a fence to the tree and then you didn't have to put in a post. Well, what happens over a period of time? That tree tries to grow over the wire, and sometimes you can pass along, where an old fence line has been. You can see, barbed wire sticking out of both sides of the tree where it's grown over it. If something is too confining, if you bind something in a certain way, it distorts the growth. That's not good. And sometimes people can exercise rulership that way. It's too stifling, it's too rigid, it's too controlling, and it distorts growth. But the other extreme is every bit as damaging. And that is where something is so loose, so permissive, so without boundaries and restraints and controls that it just grows any old way. Again, sometimes when a plant is growing up, a tree is growing up, it has to be staked, and it is tied off with guidelines that keep it from being distorted, from keep the weather and the influences of nature from twisting and distorting it. You want it to grow up straight and healthy. There've got to be some restraints that are imposed, and sometimes when something is young and tender, it's got to be protected from the other influences around. Maybe you planted a tree and there's animals around, or you got a dog around or something, and so maybe you put up a little fence around it, put up something, put some stakes up or something around it that keep whatever you don't want to get up and bump against it. Maybe it's simply the lawnmower. You don't want it to knock it, to scar it, to knock it out of place. There's got to be boundaries. There's got to be controls that are set. A family environment that is either so loose and permissive to where everybody just sort of goes and comes and does whatever, that's not healthy. That's not an environment where a person's potential is reached. Someone growing up in that environment does not reach their potential and really achieve what they're capable of doing, because the energies get dissipated out in so many different directions that nothing is given. It's not channeled. It's not controlled. It's not put in a disciplined, ordered way. But on the other hand, when something is so rigidly set, when something is so absolutely over-controlled, and that any initiative, any individuality is just squelched, that's not healthy. Neither is healthy. You see, to emphasize rulership and control, or to emphasize simply serving and helping and preserving, to emphasize one and not the other is to lend toward distortion. God gave mankind mandates that involve both. And then God set roles in human society, because God created male and female. He created man. He created him male and female. He created Adam and Eve, two human beings. And God established roles. Now, society distorts those roles. Society has devalued these roles and has distorted the value of the roles that God has given to men and women, because it is only by properly appreciating the roles that God has established, the values that God has established, if we understand why we understand the mandates that God has given us as a basic approach, we realize that we are in training to inherit from God, the Lord High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. And that God is giving us the responsibility of learning to be faithful stewards, of learning to properly exercise His government with proper control and with proper compassion, to exercise and to develop that balance that we might ultimately inherit in His family and have rulership over the universe. Because those sections of Scripture that we've made reference to are discussed back in the book of Hebrews. Back in the book of Hebrews, that in chapter 2. Hebrews 2 verse 5, it says, "Unto the angels has He not put in subjection the world to come whereof we speak. But one in a certain place testified, saying, What is man, that you're mindful of him? Or the son of man, that you visit him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You made him temporarily lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, and did set him over the work of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that He put all in subjection under Him, He left nothing that is not put under Him. But now we see not yet all things put under Him." We do see Jesus, who was made also temporarily lower than the angels. for the suffering of death. We see Him now crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God He should taste death for every man. It became Him for whom are all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. You see, ultimately God is bringing many sons unto glory. He said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. I want man to learn to be like me. So I'm giving him a mandate to exercise rulership and dominion. I'm also giving him a responsibility to preserve, to keep, to dress, to preserve, to nurture, to serve. So he is to serve the environment, and he is to rule the environment. He is to exercise both control and preservation. Man was given mandates by God. The environment involves everything from the human environment to the ecology. A responsibility of understanding that what we do does not just affect ourselves, that we are connected going back and going forward in time, and that we are part of human beings that will ultimately be part of the family of God. And so we want to learn to properly exercise these responsibilities. God has established in society, He established male and female. Now, it's important to properly value what God values. If we're going to carry out this responsibility, if we're going to carry it out in our families and in whatever endeavors of life, we need to understand that there are roles that God has established. Now, as I say, the tendency of human beings has either been to devalue, has often been to devalue one role or the other. You know, a lot of times the role of women was devalued, and it was looked upon that, well, you know, what women do isn't important, and women aren't important. Certain societies have tended to treat women as scarcely above the status of property or of cattle or something of that sort. Now, that's not what we find introduced in Genesis chapter 2. That's not the way God introduced Eve to Adam. You know, there was no help meet for the man. He saw all the animals, he gave names to them all, and there was none of them that he could share companionship with. There was none of them that was in a position to give him the kind of help to be a mate, a companion, as was Eve, who was taken from Adam. God actually took a part of Adam and used it as the starting point in making Eve. You know, what's he doing? He's fathering children, which is, you know, sort of like a dog or a bull or something. He's not raising the children. He's not providing for the children. You know, we've sort of, seems like some have rewritten the 23rd Psalm. The government is our shepherd. You know, we shall not want. And the government will provide everything from the cradle to the grave. Well, God established the role that men and women had a role to play. Now, God didn't want them trying to play one another's role. You know, He didn't want either role devalued, and He didn't want a blending to where saying, well, there's no difference in the role. You know, back in Genesis, or in Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 5, we're told, the woman shall not wear that which pertains unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the eternal your God. Now, why would God say something like that? Why was it important? Why is there anything wrong with unisex when it comes to let's say the matter of dressing? Why does God desire that there be a clear masculine feminine distinction right on down to the clothes we wear? You know, even a very fundamental, very basic distinction is laid out in 1 Corinthians 11, where the Apostle Paul, because of evidently certain problems that existed in the Corinthian church, had to address certain things, and he says in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, "Be you followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances." Keep the traditions that I delivered. "For I would have you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God." So their role, their structure. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Now who is his head? Well, that's Christ. That's what it says in verse 3. Covering, having his head, his physical head, covered. Now what is that talking about? Well, let's come on down just a little bit and we'll see. Every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For it's even all one as if she were shaven. And if a woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. If it's a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. Now, as we come on down, it brings out that in verse 13, "Judge you in yourselves. Is it comely? Is it appropriate that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it's a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering." See, it's not talking about wearing a veil. It's not talking about wearing a hat. You know, certain religions have seized one or two of these verses and they say, well, you see, you can't, women ought to wear hats in church, or they ought to wear veils. Some of you came out of that. Well, that's not what it's talking about. It didn't say her hat is given to her for a covering, or a veil is given to her for a covering. It says that God designed something right into the way that men and women present themselves, that there's to be a distinction even in terms of the way in which we wear our hair, that if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her. Her hair is given her for a covering, and a man is to have, if a man has long hair, it's a shame to him. It's a glory for a woman, and it's a shame unto a man. Now God didn't specify the exact specific styles, and He didn't give the exact length of how many millimeters constitutes long as opposed to short. But He makes the very clear distinction. He says that He describes shorn or shaven. Shorn is cropped off or clipped off in a short or a masculine manner. Shaven, of course, is just peel bald. The distinction is that a man's hair ought to be short enough not to cover his head, and a woman's hair ought to be long enough to cover her head. That's what it uses the expression here in verses 3 and 4, talking about being covered or uncovered. Now, I think we can understand that, that basically there is a softer, more flowing, feminine look to a woman's hair. It's long enough to provide a covering to her head, and a man's hair is short enough or clipped to the point that basically it reveals the shape of his head, and it's not something that flows down and covers. Now that's a very physical matter, but it was important enough that Paul had to address the issue in Corinth, because the Greeks tended to go to extremes in some of those things and didn't properly value the distinctions that God had set. We, by the way we present ourselves physically, demonstrate to God whether or not we properly accept and appreciate the role that God has established for us. Now, understand that these roles are both, the male and the female role, are both of great value in God's sight. See, they both roles deserve honor. In Ephesians chapter 6, in verse 1, it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise." Now, He didn't say just honor your father. He said honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. that it may be well with you, that you may live long upon the earth. Now, that of course is quoted from Exodus 20. It's quoted from the Ten Commandments, the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother. So honor is due to both the father and the mother. Now he says this is the first commandment with promise because this is the commandment that sets the stage for everything else. It's the first commandment a child can learn. It's the very first commandment that a child is able to keep. A little child, a little small child can learn to keep that commandment in a way that, thou shalt not commit adultery or thou shalt not murder. The child can't relate to those in nearly the personal way, or don't make an idol, or even have no other gods before the true God. A little child doesn't start with those commandments, really grasping and understanding those things, but the first commandment, and it holds out the promise for everything else. The first commandment that a child is capable of learning is how to show honor and respect to his father and his mother. And you see, respect is the basis by which a society will hold together and function. God lays great importance on the value of respect. Respect that ought to be extended to our parents, because they're in the role of God to us. As a little child, they're our life giver, they're our protector, our preserver, our provider. They're in the role of God. And as a little child, that's the starting point of being able to learn to apply God's law. And it holds the promise where a society that shows proper honor and respect to parents is a society that has stability and will endure. And so there is a preservation over a period of time. A society that disregards parents, that disregards the elderly and has contempt and just indifference is a society that is inherently unstable and is not going to endure because it won't be preserved. So God brings out that the role of father and mother are both very important and both play an important role in terms of guiding and training and teaching children. And God lays importance on learning to show respect. The law brings out back in Leviticus 19 about learning to show respect, to rise up before the hoary head, to show honor and respect to those who are older. And it's important that we teach our children to show that sort of respect. And you don't stop showing respect because you suddenly become out of your teens. We ought to show respect all of our lives. But there's a special respect that we would show to those who are older, those who are, let's say, of the generation of our parents, that there is a respect to which they are due, of recognizing a respect for age, a respect for office and position. We're told to show honor to the king, to show honor and respect to those who are in positions of rulership. We're to show respect for every human being. But we're to show a special respect for those who are set apart because of age or who are set apart because of their position, that we're to respect that and to honor that, to realize that God establishes a structure that's the way that God intends things be, that there is structure that's established right on down in the family. And so if we're going to be able to function, we have to learn to function in the context of showing proper honor and respect. Now we find in Proverbs chapter 1, in verse 8, he says, "My son, hear the instruction of your father and forsake not the law of your mother." This word, instruction, in verse 8 is a word that would probably more literally be rendered discipline. The discipline of your father, forsake not the law, the Torah, the overall way of your mother. So it has to do with the father providing guidelines, with the mother providing a teaching. So we see right here that the father and mother were intended to share the role of teaching, of guiding, and of helping their children, of exercising the mandates that God had given, each in the setting of the role that God has established, the masculine role, the feminine role that God has established as the basis of society. God has not intended that there only be one role and that women try to act like men and become masculine. He didn't intend that men should become effeminate and try to act like women, but rather God created two distinct roles that complement one another and that both are vitally important. God does not denigrate one and exalt the other. They are both vitally important. In Proverbs 31, speaking of the virtuous woman whose price is far above rubies, who is in that way priceless, God says, how valuable, what kind of value does God place on the role of a woman? Well, if she's virtuous, God says that the value is beyond calculation. Notice what he says in verse 26 of Proverbs 31. He says, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. God didn't say that he made women of lower intelligence, or that the woman was not capable of being a source of wise counsel to her husband or to her children. It says she opens her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue is the law of kindness. She looks well to the ways of her household, eats not the bread of idleness, and the result, her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. So there is a respect and there is an honor that is to be given. I emphasize this because I think we've lived in a society that has tended to devalue the role of women. You know, if you, as perhaps a young wife or a young mother, you're taking care of your children, of your family, and the response of so many will, oh, you don't work. You're only a housewife. Only? Where do you get that? Find me chapter and verse where God says that's, you're only. And I think of all the things that you could say, the idea you don't work, you don't work. If you got little kids, you're working around the clock. When do you not have something to do? There's always something to do when you have a family. And I think that, we realize that. But so often our society wants to place the wrong sort of value. The value of your role is, in our society, directly tied in with the size of the check. And if you don't bring home any check, then obviously whatever you do has no importance. If you bring home a low check, then it has low importance. Well, I think it's important that we not buy into the false concept that society tries to produce. Because society is disintegrating. Society places low value on a lot of things that God says are of great value, and society places great value on things that God says are trash. Things that are going to pass away. See, God has created us, we're not the happenstance of chance or blind evolution. We're the product of intelligent forethought, of planning and of purpose. We were created for a purpose. We were specifically created male and female. That's a part of the plan of the purpose of God. We have value because God has attached value. God has assigned different roles to male and female, and He wants us to value and to reflect our acceptance and our appreciation of those roles in the way that we present ourselves before Him. Right on down to the way that we physically groom ourselves, that we demonstrate to God our acceptance and our appreciation of the roles that He has set. But we should not approach that from a standpoint of thinking that one role is important and the other is trivial. Because God does not trivialize either the role of the woman or the role of the man. They are each roles that complement the other and are of great value. And that's important for us to have. And there are opportunities for both men and women to exercise the same mandates of exercising rulership and control, of nurturing and preserving and protecting and serving. You know, those fit in both the masculine and the feminine sphere of life. It carries through in any aspect. You know, it's can carry through in the home of trying to exercise rulership and control, to bring the home under control, even just physically, in terms of making it a pleasant environment, making it an environment that the family is going to want to spend time in. It carries through into child rearing, of exercising control, of exercising proper guidelines, setting those guidelines, of bringing under control, not letting things just go in an uncontrolled fashion, but realize that it's not just lining out in rigid control, but there is the aspect of serving and of nurturing, of preserving, of enhancing in a serving way. So all of it carries through. And so when we come then to the instructions that were given in the New Testament, as well as, of course, in the Old, but we have specific instructions that were given in the New Testament because God's people were being surrounded or were living in the midst of a pagan, corrupt society. And they were coming out of those societies. People were coming out of a world that had been shaped by Greek thought and Greek values, and those values were not healthy. They weren't good. They weren't constructive in many areas of life. And so the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter and others spent time giving specific instructions about family life and about the values that were to be demonstrated, because in many cases they contradicted what was going on in the society around. We can look at society and we can see the ups and downs. We can see the ebbing and flowing of different values. But there's a constancy to what God says. God places value in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul tells Titus, he says, "Speak you the things which become or which lead to, which are conducive to sound doctrine." The older men, they need to be sober, that is, alert and self-controlled. They need to be grave and temperate, which just basically means to doesn't mean that they're not to be smiling or happy. The word grave carries with it the connotation of dignity. They have a responsibility in terms of setting an example for those who are younger. They're to exercise and to demonstrate self-control. They're to be sound in faith and in love and in patience. You know, they've learned certain lessons of life and they need to set an example, those who are older, that those who are younger can look to it. The older women, likewise. Also, the older women have a responsibility to set an example just like the older men. They need to be in behavior as becomes holiness. They need to reflect holiness. They need to reflect the attributes and the characteristics of holy women, of women of God. Not being false accusers, not getting off into gossip and given to much wine, but rather teachers of good things. There's a lot of things of value that they've learned and can share. And lessons of life. As we live our lives, there are a lot of things we look back on and a lot of things that maybe we wish we had done differently. Well, if we can learn from those who are older and those who've gone through other experiences, we don't have to remake every set of mistakes. God intended that if society and the family would function as it ought, that each generation is able to be helped up and start on a little higher rung of the ladder than the one before. We're able to profit from what has come before. We're able to learn from the experience and the wisdom, and you have the accumulated wisdom of generations. Can you imagine in the world to come, at the end of 1,000 years of society building instead of tearing down? Of a family being able to help the one generation learning from the generation to come, preceding it, and therefore being able to maybe start the next generation a little higher up the ladder, on a little higher rung. And that we're able to build on what has come before. We don't have to totally remake every single mistake. That's important, but we have to value the wisdom of those who have gone before. So the older women are told that they can teach the younger women the importance of being sober, of being wise, of loving their husbands, of loving their children. Not getting caught up in other things, but of realizing the importance of really showing love to their husbands and their children. To be discreet, to be pure and innocent, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded, to be self-restrained, not to give themselves over to excess. And he says, Timothy, you show a pattern of good works for these younger men. You show uncorruptness and gravity and sincerity in your doctrine. You demonstrate in your conversation and sound speech things that can't be condemned. You demonstrate an example and you let others follow that. What we have to understand is that we have opportunities in every aspect of society, in every aspect of our lives. We have it in the home, we have it in the family, we have it on the job, we have it in every aspect of our lives to be wise stewards of whatever responsibilities God has given us. We need to value the responsibilities. Sometimes things can appear small, they can appear trivial, they can be repetitious. You think, if I clean it up, it's just going to be messed up again tomorrow. But we're developing a pattern and an approach to life. We're developing godly character. We're learning the principles of godly rulership in whatever sphere of life we have. Now, we are of a wide variety of ages and circumstances. Some of you have young children at home that you're rearing. Others of you, your children are grown and gone. Maybe you have grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Some are retired and some are just beginning and their working career. We have a wide variety that's reflected. But we all have our sphere in life. We have our circumstance. We have those areas and those people that we have influence over and that we have connection and contact with. We have our areas of life. And it's very important that we learn to exercise responsible stewardship in those areas that are ours. In those areas that we have been given responsibility for. Because God has created us in His image. He's created us with the potential to enter His family. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Man was given mandates to rule and to serve, to apply the very mandates that God Himself applies to the universe. Now, Hebrews tells us that right now we're not over all things, but the time is coming when we will be, because God is bringing many sons unto glory. Brethren, if we can step back and have the overview, the big picture, then the specific things we do in life, everything from the way we treat our wives and our husbands and our children and our friends and our neighbors and our brethren at church, the way that we take care of our room, our house, our property, our job, or whatever areas, that we can see how all of those specific things, no matter how small, how those specific things fit in to the overview. And how we have a chance by learning to be faithful in little things to ultimately hear the voice of Jesus Christ saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in little things. Now I will give you rulership over much. Enter you into the joy of your Lord."